The relationship between a modern industrialised society and carbon is one of threats and opportunities. The threats are frequently expressed in terms of disasters such as global warming, which, if indeed it does come to pass, will result in our planet becoming uninhabitable for ourselves and its other residents.
The opportunities are, in many cases, less clear. Take as one example graphene. This is a carbon compound that, at present, is claimed to be the world's thinnest, lightest, strongest and stiffest material. It has also been shown to be an excellent conductor of heat and electricity. All in all, graphene would appear to be the next big thing, with governments around the world investing billions in seeking to realise the claimed potential of the material. However, it is possible that we have been here before. Science inevitably makes new discoveries, some of which will prove to be major advances, while others will quietly fade into the background. Part of the problem is the rate at which discoveries are made. It is quite possible for the next big thing to be displaced by another next big thing that is just beyond the horizon before it has even got to the product development stage. Carbon nanotubes, for example, were at one point destined to be the basis of a new type of lighter, thinner and more efficient television screen. However, before that particular future arrived, along came plasma and LCD displays that outcompeted nanotubes, at least in that particular area. The threats and opportunities can be argued to flow from the versatile nature of carbon. It almost seems as though it would be difficult to develop a more versatile element, even if you wanted to. Current estimates place the number of carbon compounds at over 5 million, within which organic compounds are particularly well represented. The vast majority of these are both invisible to and ignored by us. However, a very small number of them are being given a great deal of attention solely because of the threat that they are seen to represent. Within this presentation, a number of concepts will be presented. The first of these is referred to as legislative push, the intention of a society to use legal requirements to push development in a particular direction. As far as the built environment is concerned, a good example of legislative push is the desire of Scotland and other countries to reduce the use of energy by the built environment. In this scenario, energy can be argued as a relatively easy means of measuring carbon, with one particular compound being focused on as the main threat, CO2. However, legislative push can be met with resistance in the form of what some would argue as realism. The Royal Academy of Engineering published a report in 2010 that claimed the zero carbon by 2020 objective would only serve to widen the gulf between what government deemed to be required and the construction industry would actually be able to deliver. In this case, the gap between the two results largely from a lack of carbon reduction skills within the industry. Given the industry's poor reputation regarding the development of new skills, even a legislative push may not be sufficient to deliver ambitious objectives. Given the possibility that legislative push will not fully achieve targets such as zero carbon by 2020, is there another approach that could help to address the carbon reduction skills gap? If the problem is largely one of the industry not understanding the nature of carbon in general, and CO2 in particular, perhaps at least some of the training effort could be focused on ecology, with a particular focus on using the ecology of carbon as a means of pulling CO2 levels downward. Such an approach is not to be confused with expressions such as greening the industry. Carbon ecology is focused on the interactions that are possible between carbon compounds, particularly organic compounds, within the boundaries of the built environment. The intention being to find ways of both reducing the production of new carbon, but also to reduce the level of old carbon that has already found its way into the built environment system. There is no doubt that such an approach seems an ambitious one, but there is a high probability that simply relying on legislative push will not get the job completely done, and so some assistance is required. Perhaps this is essentially a case of increasing the complexity and number of self-organising systems used within the built environment. Reference to self-organising systems will, for some, revive a link with self-organising biological systems, otherwise known as autopoietic systems, and the diversity of outputs from such systems. A key feature of autopoietic systems is that the outputs from them tend toward complexity and differentiation from the generally chaotic environment in which they emerged. In other words, such systems have their own set of laws that allow them to operate in a dynamic, open manner rather than a mechanistic and closed manner. This can be considered as a lockstep approach to development within which each emerging complex product reaches a point at which it has a sufficiently stable pattern for the system to lock that specific development. This step then becomes the springing point for the next step. In this manner, dynamic or unstable emerging products allow the system to gain complexity, which is locked in a series of steps that secure each new product once it has reached a sustainable and stable level of complexity. Such a system allows for diversity, complexity, stability, and sustainability. The natural environment contains many autopoietic systems, and if a truly sustainable built environment is to be achieved, it is arguable that it must become either a single autopoietic system or a grouping of interacting autopoietic systems. In other words, it should become biologically self-organising so as to ensure that viable development steps within the environment are locked and therefore not lost, while also allowing for the emergence of increasingly complex development steps that respond to perturbations in the environment. The built environment would therefore become an ecologically responsive combination of locked patterns that deal with existing problems and emerging patterns that are reactions to new problems. One model of this general nature that has been proposed in the context of cities is the Portugali model. A key feature of the Portugali model is the concept of cities as an interrepresentational network, or IRN, for which a form of self-organisation is claimed. The self-organisation is actualised through the functioning of free agents acting in combination with cognitive agents. In essence, the cognitive agents represent the laws of the system that guide the free agents in achieving new patterns in response to specific stimuli within the city's internal and external environments. A simple example of this model in action would be that rather than predetermining where all the footpaths within the city are to be, the cognitive agents would be pushed by the system's laws to become aware of where people actually walk within the city, and then provide the rules for the free agents to develop stable patterns in the form of the required footpaths. Such an example also fits with the concept of ecology pull. One aspect of the ecology of the city pulls the development in response to specific needs and does so in a sustainable manner. If the paths are placed where people want to walk, then they will be used more frequently than paths that are predetermined so as to push people to walk in specific locations. However, could this actually work?
Cities are complex entities that have a life cycle, and in many respects that is similar to the life cycle of biological systems. Over time, it seems that a number of different approaches have been applied to the management of that life cycle.
Generally, the intention seems to be to maximise the benefits of a city while minimising the disbenefits. In the modern context, the emphasis may be changing to one of eliminating the climate change-related disbenefits, such as pollution, energy use, CO2 emissions and so on, while mitigating any resultant negative impact on related benefits, such as wealth generation through economic activity. As we globally move toward a greater number of megacities, the ability to provide stability whilst also allowing development in a sustainable manner becomes increasingly desirable. The current approach seems to be one of using legislative push to provide stability, for example in terms of managing the size, location and performance level of buildings that are allowed, as the basis on which economic activity, such as wealth generation, can take place. In such an approach, it can be argued that the emphasis is on economic activity and therefore the laws of the system are formed so as to encourage and protect such activity. Application of the Portugali model would perhaps result in planning laws, for example, being encoded in cognitive agents that decide on the stable patterns to be produced through their dynamic activity by the free agents such as property developers, contractors and so on. A further development would then be to add some form of currency that allows a measure of success or failure, but also permits transactions between individual free agents and also between free agents and cognitive agents to take place. Given that the key disbenefit that is being presently targeted is carbon, and in particular CO2, it would seem appropriate that energy becomes the currency of the self-organising city system. This would then allow for the required stable and locked patterns to be represented through energy use, giving a building block for the city system of locked energy patterns, or LEPs. The ongoing development of the city as it grows and changes to respond to external and internal stimuli could also be represented through energy use, but in this case the energy patterns would not be locked. Instead, they would be open to being stimulated by changes within the environment and are therefore open energy patterns, or OEPs. Is there any evidence that LEPs or OEPs can be identified within the manner that cities are currently managed?
Jan, could you briefly outline your role and how you see it as relating to the carbon problem?
Well, I'm the Manager of Projects, Partnerships and Funding for Aberdeen City Council in Economic Development. And in Aberdeen, we see carbon not as a problem, but as an opportunity, and an opportunity for competitive advantage, and that the Council will be a flagship example of how you can do things.
What is Aberdeen City Council's overall objective with regard to carbon levels and over what timescale?
By 2015, we've actually said we want to reduce our own carbon emissions by 23%, and that's 2015. Now that means in money terms, per annum we're looking at a reduction of £2 million on costs, and from carbon tonnes we're looking at reducing by 2015 27,500 carbon tonnes.
How much flexibility do you think is available to Aberdeen City Council with regard to the management of carbon in the built environment? For example, how much of Aberdeen's built environment predates the focus on carbon? And this is usually regarded as a significant constraint, retrofitting, those kind of problems. Also the manner of the legislative push, things like building regulations, etc., perhaps constrains what can be done with new additions to the built environment.
From retrofitting, and I'm glad you brought that up because we've been working on the Build with Care project, specifically looking at policy because there is none. There's advice, but there is actually no real policy to help. Now, as an exemplar example, the council with its own old property, well, as you know with Marshall College, we've rebuilt it, but there have been other areas like schools and some of our Victorian tenements and our high-rise apartments where we've actually done a lot of work on insulation and district heating to be able to give affordable warmth to those of our clients who really need it, and then being able to use the excess of that energy and that heat for public buildings. Now for us that's an exemplar, and we aim to be able to work with our partners like the universities who want to do similar schemes to build onto our own decentralised energy policy, which is not legislative, but it is our policy that we have for our property, and we're happy to work with partners on that.
Right, so you feel that the organisation is going beyond the legislative minimum?
Absolutely, because we actually see this as a business solution as well as a civic solution for a lot of the problems that we do have when it comes to the cost of heating swimming pools. We've had to close some swimming pools because they're too expensive to heat, and it's either we pay for the heat for the swimming pools or else we pay for the heat for the schools. The education becomes more important than the swimming pool and the inefficient pool. We also know, and this is part of our 5-year business plan, that renewables and having energy security for the city is so important for a business decision for the council, because we would far prefer to put money in services than putting money in paying for energy. So what we're trying to do is we've got we're developing our own strategy for our own properties so that we can have energy clusters across the city. Renewable, it could be district heating, it could be wind, but in small suites. And there are a variety of EU projects that we're working on. For example, music, which is mitigating urban carbon in the city complex, and we're using our GIS system to be able to see where would be the best place to place things like that. We also work in partnership with, as REG is a very good example, and this comes into my funding end, where we've been able to attract the largest amount of money in Europe for the UK of €40 million towards a marine wind farm. Now these may not seem, they are not legislative requirements, but we're looking at the energy security of our city because we're a global economy.
How much carbon is being locked or sequestered, do you think? In other words, how reliable is the baseline measurement?
Well, the Department of Energy Conservation does some excellent work on looking at how much per capita are we emitting. And since 2005, per capita, we have been decreasing, and I've got figures here from the DECC, where our emissions have reduced over time and continue to reduce over time. I'm looking at these tables, but per capita total, and this is bringing in industry, this is domestic, and this is road transport. This is everything that we would emit in carbon. We've gone from 9.4 carbon emissions to 8.6, and that's quite a reduction, especially when you know at that particular time our population was reducing at that time. It is increasing now, so it'd be interesting to do the figures, but those are really compelling figures.
In what ways has the response to carbon changed during your time with Aberdeen City Council? Is it fair to say that the Council has tried to identify responses that go beyond the minimum established by the legislative push? In other words, is there an awareness that there may be additional strategies that complement the legal requirements?
Well, I know there's been a big change because my old job, when I came to Aberdeen 5 years ago, I was a strategist for sustainable development. And in those days, it was that team that did everything. Really didn't talk to anyone, but that was the expectation. Make the council green, make the city green. But you can't do that. It has to become known, it has to become a culture. And I would say what we've done is taking it away from the hemp and sandals and tree hugging type of idea to something that is a business requirement because it will help reduce cost. B, to look at it that we're looking at sustaining what we've got rather than diminishing what we've got. And the final point is it just makes sense. And so the policies that we're looking at the future are for EU 2020, but they're enabling policies to be able to help business as well, that it's not just in the area of the green team. It is the business of everyone, for our schools, for our social care organisations. It's the way we operate. Our housing and environment, it's important in enterprise planning and even in our own asset management. And that is the core business, our asset management. And that is the challenge, not just for our local authority, but all local authorities across the world.
Speaking of tree hugging, do any of these additions give a value to green spaces within the built environment rather than focusing solely on the buildings?
Well, the green spaces are integral, and we have an open space strategy that is going to be part of our local development plan. It is a strategy, but it needs to be implemented, and this is where our work from a business enterprise point of view, so our work with investors to be able to put that to us. And we are a world energy centre. This is what we do. And there are many other cities, a world energy city, and there are many other cities. Our competition is not in Britain. Our peers are not in Britain. Our peers are in Norway, in Australia, in Houston, in all over the world. Abu Dhabi. These are the people that we have to line ourselves up with. And their staff, the migrant staff that come over here to work in their companies, they expect a level of green space. They expect access to the green environment. These are people that are highly discerning.
Would you view such additions as representing an ecology pull, using an understanding of ecology to pull the carbon system in a particular, hopefully downward direction? Indeed, is there sufficient understanding of the role of carbon in an ecological sense?
I wouldn't say in an ecological sense as a whole, but there are some initiatives that we've done, and I'm really quite happy to say that I might have been one of the catalysts in this. Our administration, when they came in, the current administration, put a challenge for us, and that was to plant a tree for every citizen in Aberdeen. At that time, it was only 202,000. Now it's 210,000. We couldn't believe it. We did pricings, and it was just not probable. But since then, we've done very expensive. But since then, we've done some really good work with the Forestry Commission, voluntary organisations like Aberdeen Green Space, and our own in-house people, and voluntary groups and some companies. And I'm proud to say that we're nearly there to our target. Now, I would say that people understand about trees. They may not understand about the ecological value, but they do know that there's some value when it comes to capturing and storing carbon in order to use it, as we're going to use it in Marshall College, for biomass, because you need virgin trees to make pellets, and we're going to do that with Hazelhead Park, and some of the trees that we are pruning, we're going to be using some of the waste that comes out of there and get them chipped and use it in our boiler.
So that essentially solves a number of problems in one approach.
Absolutely, and when you think about it, it's just the cycle of life. We planted those trees many years ago, we pruned them. Instead of them going to waste, they're going to go to good use to heat Marshall College, and we wouldn't have had that opportunity if it hadn't have been for the Build with Care project, which actually paid for it.
How mature would you say the UK approach to the management of carbon is in comparison to approaches you've experienced elsewhere, such as, for example, in New Zealand? One UK example of maturity could be the Woodland Carbon Code.
I think the Woodland Carbon Code is very exciting, and it reminds me of things that I've seen here in the UK, where we have people in government, and we have people in government departments and in councils who are very enthusiastic and have a great knowledge of how we can use our natural open space, how we can use our trees, how we can use our natural resources to the betterment of the planet. I think that's great. But the level of maturity, I think that there's an enthusiasm. There's a big enthusiasm in the UK, but there may not be the knowledge. And that is a difference where I would say, where I come from in New Zealand and what I've seen in Europe, it's hardwired in the local people's DNA. They understand. I went to school, I was taught to understand the implications of my actions. When I go to Germany, I feel at home because these people understand as I do. Here, I have seen a big change since when I started with young people who are going to school and they're learning about the natural environment. The Eco Schools program in Scotland is fantastic, and I've seen eco schools grow exponentially in Aberdeen, and the young people have a huge knowledge, and this of course goes into their families, and then when they grow up and have families, it will build. I see there's an opportunity and an enthusiasm. It's not quite mature. I think it's in the initiation stage.
You previously mentioned Energetica. Do you think this project is to some extent struggling with the maturity aspect of this problem?
I think that this Energetica project is an example that we could find the competitive advantage in this, but you really have to understand the market that you want to engage with. And I know I'm using a lot of economic terms, But if you have such a design as Energetica, you're talking about dealing with business and attracting business.
If you were able to propose one specific response to the carbon problem that is not currently being actively pursued in the UK, what would it be?
There needs to be a renewable mix in our energy that we have. I think there's a bit of a fear on the energy mix. What will be the energy mix? There's been a little bit of sackcloth and ashes. Oh, I'll have to give up this. Lent only comes once a year. And I think what we should be looking at is a new carbon way of life, a low carbon way of life.
That's been very informative, very helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It seems that there is the possibility of some cities, as in the previous example, seeking to manage the carbon problem through the application of what may be referred to as proto-locked energy patterns. Patterns that have the potential to become full LEPs but do not at present quite fit the bill.
The impression is that the approach being operated does not make use of the potential of complexity to contribute an effective response to problematic stimuli in the system. In such a scenario, it is inevitable that the minimum ecological complexity, such as planting more trees and adding ever-increasing amounts of insulation to buildings, is applied to the problem. Such solutions could be argued to be examples of locked energy patterns themselves, in that we know that adding insulation reduces heat loss and therefore energy consumption decreases. Or does it? A recent Department of Energy and Climate Change publication gathered a range of statistics and data on energy consumption in the UK between 1970 and 2001. The domestic sector accounted for 30% of energy consumed in 2001, only a 2% increase from the 1990 level. Within the domestic sector, 84% of energy use in 2000 was related to space heating and production of hot water. When compared to the 1990 level of domestic energy use, increases in output of the sector resulted in an overall increase in energy use of 4.2 million tonnes of oil equivalent. However, when measured on the basis of energy use per household, the overall trend is relatively flat. Natural peaks relate to decreases in external temperatures, but the overall increase in energy use by the sector is attributed to such factors as increased provision of central heating, higher average indoor temperatures, and an increased number of households. The increasing levels of insulation over the period do not appear to have achieved significant benefits. The only sign of an overall improvement in efficiency within the sector, a 16% fall in energy used for cooking between 1970 and 2000. However, in terms of any ecology that may be envisaged in connection with that fall, another government report notes that between 1992 and 2004, spending on food and drink consumed outside the home increased by 102.2%. Perhaps this increase can be taken as an example of an emerging open energy pattern resulting from social or ecological change.
The usual interpretation of biological systems is that the more complex they are, the more open they become, and also the more intelligent.
As any system becomes more open, it has an increasing potential to select amongst a number of possibly effective responses to perturbations within its environment. Thus, if a basic, relatively closed mechanical system, such as a simple internal combustion engine, becomes too hot, its only response is to eventually cease and stop working. If a simple, relatively open biological system, which is nonetheless more complex than the previous mechanical system, such as a plant, overheats, it tries to manage its temperature by evaporating water. If it starts to run out of available water, it then wilts and will eventually die. If a more complex and open biological system, such as a human, overheats, it has multiple responses available, such as opening a window or turning on the air conditioning, and has both the intelligence and required level of self-awareness to select the most effective response or combination of responses. Given the complexity of even a present-day city system, as opposed to the possible complexity of a megacity system of the future, it may be too ambitious to think in terms of a single autopoietic system that can deal with all of the problems, stimuli and perturbations within it. Rather, it seems more realistic to think in terms of an interacting group of autopoietic systems that can respond to one or more of the problems individually, but when acting collectively, address all of the city's problems. In order to give a context for this suggestion, consider your impression of modern-day New York, hardly an ecological paradise. Just over 400 years ago, the approximately 300 square miles occupied by New York City is claimed to have comprised 55 ecological communities and a level of biodiversity per acre that was not far off the level of current US national parks such as Yellowstone and Yosemite. An ongoing study known as the Wailekia Project is seeking to identify how many, indeed if any, of those 55 ecological systems survive within those 300 square miles that are now inhabited by around 6.4 million people. In order to take the proposal a stage further, it would be interesting to test a hypothesis such as requiring 55 different ecological systems to ensure the sustainable functioning of a 300 square mile area of natural biodiversity indicates that 55 would also represent the minimum number of individual autopoietic systems required to achieve a sustainable ecology for a city of the same size.
Within the context of a possible 55 required autopoietic systems for the management of a city ecology, it is doubtful that all of those systems will need to be attenuated to the risks presented by carbon.
Unlike a natural environment, a city environment has a number of systems that are man-made and therefore not self-organising, in that they do not evolve a set of laws that allow them to prosper. They are given the rules by their human designers. Whilst it is true that there is an increasing use of artificial intelligence and fuzzy logic in the context of built environment systems, the current laws provided for such systems typically remain relatively simple. Rather than directly tackling the complex demands of a complete city's functions, these first steps have been focused on issues such as space planning and land use in the context of urban planning. However, there are signs that this is about to change. IBM have taken the belief that future cities will naturally become more networked environments in response to the demands of increasingly complex infrastructure demands and, regardless how comfortable you may feel about this, rising surveillance demands. The IBM vision of a future city could be regarded as an ecology based on applications. In the same manner as you may now buy apps for your smartphone, future city building owners may buy apps for their buildings. At present, these would seem to be relatively simple apps for actions such as powering down buildings in proportion to the number of residents within them. This would be more complex if joined with the ongoing work on learning systems that, over time, learn what behaviours building residents may exhibit. IBM is explicit, however, that its vision is one of developing building and city systems that allow them to operate as if they were living organisms. The concept of networked living cities relying on a group of interconnected autopoietic systems may seem more science fiction than science fact, but the tipping point may be a lot closer than you imagine. You may not have heard of the Korean city of Songdo, but this is claimed to be an instant city that, when completed, will be completely controlled by computer networks between buildings, cars, waste collection, and so on. Songdo is also claimed to represent the tipping point in terms of cities that have computing technology embedded in their infrastructure, and this is a key factor in it being regarded as a sustainable city. The waste system, for example, will be a centralised pneumatic one that collects both wet and dry waste. This has the environmental benefit of not requiring waste collection vehicles to roam the city. As such systems develop increasing complexity, possibly based on locked energy patterns, their intelligence will also increase. There are forecasters who are currently predicting the emergence of cities as arcologies, architectural ecologies focused on achieving a single, integrated hyperstructure that is self-sufficient and self-contained. However, is it a step too far to also envisage cities that have sufficient intelligence within their systems to become self-aware?
If megacities or our colleges are to function effectively, it seems that there will be the need for them to accommodate high densities of humans.
While there may be any number of green spaces, canals, etc., the humans inhabiting such cities will largely be housed on a high-density basis. This usually pushes the development plan towards high-rise structures, an area where carbon is also having an impact. The ecology of carbon was previously noted as being versatile. Carbon is a unique atom structure that results in a tetravalent nature. In other words, it can combine easily but strongly with other carbon atoms to achieve catenation, strong chain-like structures that are also stable. Carbon is also able to form multiple bonds with other elements, such as oxygen and nitrogen, with the result being a huge variety of carbon compounds. From a construction perspective, one particular form of carbon has been getting quite a lot of attention: carbon nanotubes, or CNTs. These are being incorporated as a reinforcement in concrete mixes, with the resultant concrete being lighter, more ductile and stronger, typically in the region of 200 to 300% greater than standard concrete. Thus it becomes possible to build taller buildings that have a similar mass to their smaller predecessors that use standard concrete. It is of course also possible to build housing of a more traditional scale that uses less concrete. However, CNTs are not without ecological problems of their own. Carbon nanotubes have been found to have possible health risks related both to the production process and to the completed product. Process-related risks include the emission of at least 15 different aromatic hydrocarbons, including 4 that are similar to hydrocarbons found in cigarette smoke and vehicle emissions. The chemical signature of CNTs has also been found to be less consistent than previously thought, thus indicating a wider variety of toxicity levels and also making the tubes more difficult to identify once they become part of an environment. As they are also more durable than diamonds, they tend to persist when released into an environment and therefore represent a long-term pollution hazard. One possible area of concern is that there are suggestions that CNTs may cause lung damage. However, such is the level of investment in CNT production and development that the pollution problem has been recognised as part of CNT ecology, and work has commenced on finding a means of degrading CNTs. 2 promising products that have been identified recently. One is based on a human enzyme and the other is based on a horseradish enzyme. Carbon ecology is truly a variable thing. By more fully understanding both the ecology of carbon and the requirements for city-based autopoietic systems, might future cities become sustainable by not only reducing their output of problem forms of carbon, such as CO2, but also by converting CO2 to an economically valuable form, such as carbon monoxide. This compound can be used as a source of energy and biomass for microbes, which may themselves be of ecological value elsewhere in the city's systems, and because of carbon's versatility and tetravalent nature, it can quite easily be converted into hydrocarbons or methane, which can then be used as a fuel by the city's housing, offices and industrial processes. Traditional approaches to achieving the conversion of CO2 to carbon monoxide are classed as energy intensive, but a recent breakthrough has achieved a much lower energy requirement and does this by mimicking the actions of natural organisms. The process uses enzyme-modified titanium dioxide that, in the presence of visible light, encourages some of CO2's electrons to jump to the enzyme, leaving carbon monoxide behind. At present, the titanium dioxide is in the form of nanotubes, but it is envisaged that further research will either identify a natural organism that can be used to replace the nanotubes or define a suitable genetically engineered organism. As technologies such as the CO2 to carbon monoxide conversion emerge, the concept of a sustainable city ecology arguably becomes more realistic. It seems possible for the growth of future cities to become sustainable to the point where megacities, or even hyperstructure ecologies, can seriously be envisaged. For such ecologies to be sustainable in the long term, however, the technologies will need to be managed by biologically open and self-organising systems. These may initially be provided with laws by which they are to operate, but such laws may only be the starting point. Over time, the systems may be allowed to add complexity through locking initial and then any subsequent successful patterns. This complexity may ultimately result in a level of intelligence that allows a system to become self-aware, at which point it may well be regarded as being a more open one than its human originators. When considering ecologies, megacities, and self-organising open systems reliant upon artificial intelligence, it is perhaps inevitable that there is a loss of focus on what happens at the intermediate scales. Nanotechnology and artificial intelligence may deal with the very small scale requirements of the system, and possibly artificial intelligence on its own may take care of the overall objective of achieving a sustainable city, but what happens in between? What are the millions of humans inhabiting these future ecologies? The realistic response is that very few of the technologies considered in this presentation are currently at the stage of becoming ubiquitous. Carbon nanotubes are in common use by the defence and aerospace industries and are at an early stage of adoption by some construction industry processors. This is a material that first emerged from the labs in the mid-1950s, over 50 years ago. It is generally claimed that it takes at least 20 years for any new material to have any real impact, much less reach the tipping point at which it becomes ubiquitous.
The presentation has not sought to prescribe any specific future direction. However, the material covered does indicate that a better understanding of the ecology of carbon opens up a number of opportunities for the management of problems such as unacceptably high levels of CO2. Even in the current relatively low-tech environment of solutions to this problem, a carbon skills gap has been identified. It seems reasonable to assume that any SME, architect, contractor or consultant organisation that wishes to have a future in the economies of such cities would need to address that particular problem. Perhaps now is the time to consider seriously that nanotechnology for beginners course. Thank you.